Okay. Okay. Yeah. Trying to see. Should be working. For those viewing at home, we do apologize this week. We're running a little late because of technical difficulties. So if you can just bear with us. I'll mention at the end. Huh? That's fine. I'll mention it, bro. Okay. No, it's fine. I let them know that we're gonna be we're gonna be late. Ran into technical difficulties. Um, huh? Well, pretty much it. Because if I was to write more, it's gonna take longer. So unfortunately, I know you guys don't have the documents. If you guys can use your phone, that'd be great. But instead of writing it all down because I don't have time, I'll just go ahead and explain it. And if you guys want, again, you can view the documents. And for the viewers at home, if you want to view the document of or the outline, you can view it on Google Docs by going to our YouTube link. And this is lesson 2.2. So you can check out the outline. The Google link is there for the Google Docs. Huh? Description of the video. Oh, in the description, yeah, as Saad said, in the description of the video, you'd find the link. It's an outline. It's going to explain everything that I'm going to talk about. I know you guys may not be able to view the whiteboard, so I'm sure the outline will be very resourceful and helpful. So for the past 3 weeks, this is week 4 of our teaching course. It is an 8-week teaching course. First 2 weeks, we had Saad going over how to preach the gospel, and that was 2 parts. One was the theology behind the gospel, what is the gospel, and the second was more practical. And they ended up interacting. They did some role play, and so the third week we started on our apologetics lesson, and we went over a few things again. The Google Docs is available on the YouTube channel. On the description section of each lesson. 2.1 was last week's lesson when we started apologetics, and we discussed certain things such as the nature of evidence, empirical versus philosophical. We discussed persuasion versus proof. We discussed how to deal with competing worldviews, and most importantly, we discussed the transcendental argument. The approach that I'm going to be teaching and that I have taught in the past, being last week, has been the presuppositional approach. And so there's a difference. There is different camps within apologetics. So This week we're going to continue. Again, it is the presuppositional approach, so it does utilize what we call the transcendental argument for God. Um, and you can find, again, the outline for it in lesson 2.1 if you go to our YouTube channel. But let me see if I can backtrack before we get onto this week. This week we're going to be talking about comparative religious worldviews versus last week it was more dealing with apologetics in a very broad sense, in the tools that we ought to use, how we practice apologetics, and etc. And so let me see if I can backtrack a little because it is related to this, and how we practice apologetics. Just because we're dealing with a different set of worldviews, being religious in its nature, doesn't mean it is any different. In practice, it may seem different, but as far as the principles and the tools we utilize is the same. So I am going to backtrack a little bit. So last week we dealt with the nature of evidence. Last week we dealt with the nature of evidence, where you had empirical evidence and you have philosophical evidence, where not all evidence is necessarily material in its nature. We also dealt with proof and persuasion, that you can have proof for God, irrefutable proof for God, yet not persuade your opponent because of certain reasons. And so when discussing apologetics, when you practice apologetics, when you're sharing your faith, you're defending the faith, usually the most common method is to present evidence and go back and forth, where your worldview sees evidence a certain way, concludes it a certain way, and your opponent's worldview concludes it a certain way. And so what we had discussed was that ultimately it does not come down to the evidence, because we both look at the same evidence. We just conclude differently based on our worldview. Worldview is a network of beliefs, a lens in which you interpret reality, in which you see and perceive reality. And so the way you perceive reality are your set of beliefs, your networks of beliefs that are being presupposed prior to even looking at the evidence. And so those presuppositions are causing you to interpret that evidence differently. That's why you can have a Christian and an atheist look at the same evidence, same data, and come to different conclusions. And so what we had said is that ultimately the real issue comes down to the worldviews. And so we need to evaluate the worldviews for what they are. And we had this discussed, I'm not going to be putting it up because it's going to take away from some time, but do you guys remember some of the ways that we discussed that we ought to evaluate worldviews? Corresponds to reality is one of the primary ones. First one was to evaluate the worldview internally. To see, one, whether the system of beliefs that your opponent is holding to is internally coherent, is internally consistent. Is there any arbitrariness? Is there any inconsistencies? Does it make sense in of itself? Because that could be one thing. You can have a worldview make sense, but that is not the only basis in which we evaluate worldviews. The second basis is, as Emil said, we see if it corresponds to reality. That is what truth is. It's a corresponding theory of truth in which our worldview makes sense within reality. If it correlates, if it corresponds to reality. And so I'll give you an example. And this is the relationship between ontology and epistemology. And so you have a worldview. Don't mind my drawing. You have a worldview, and this is ontology. It is what it is. This ontology is a study of what is, its existence, its nature, substance. And so what exists in reality may not necessarily be what we believe. We can have certain beliefs, and a belief is simply a proposition that may or may not be true. But here's where epistemology comes in. And so we have worldviews, or a set of beliefs, And our beliefs must correspond to reality. So one, we evaluate the worldview. A worldview, essentially, network of beliefs, is the basis of how you perceive the world. And so the basis has a certain foundation, ultimate authority, in which all other beliefs from your worldview stem from. And so, and this is where you get into epistemology, but when you're internally critiquing that worldview, you're trying to see if it is consistent, does it make sense, what are the consequences, is there any arbitrariness, and once you can evaluate that worldview based on those, you're now trying to see if it corresponds to reality. Because you can have a worldview make sense, but yet it's not true. It doesn't correspond to reality. An example I always bring is the Marvel universe. Within the Marvel universe, you have a completely, with network of beliefs, you have a completely consistent system. It is internally consistent. The problem is it does not correspond to reality. It is not true. And so trying to figure out what is, or how we know what is the study of epistemology. And this is how the two correlate. You cannot have them separated. There is a relationship between epistemology and ontology. It's how we know the things we know. When I ask you, how do you believe, how do you know what you believe? And we ought to have reasons for the things that we believe. It's you're practicing epistemology. You're basically saying, I think this is how the world is. Well, how do you know how the world is or what the world is? When I say world, referring to reality. And so you justify your claim. You're making a claim about something that exists ontologically. And you're saying, I know it because of a certain reason. That reason is your justification. It is justified true belief. And justified true belief is knowledge of reality. I know that certain things in reality exist because for that claim, I can justify it to correspond to reality. And that is a justified true belief. So those are the two bases in which we evaluate worldviews. And ultimately, it comes down to a worldview. Think of it practically. You have a foundation. Instead of arguing for building blocks, you have the building blocks, you have the foundation. Instead of arguing for what is on top of that foundation, and going from top to bottom, you go from bottom to up. If you deal with the foundation, and you can remove that foundation, all the beliefs, everything that stands on that foundation crumbles. It is destroyed. That's why ultimately, and now effectively as well as for other reasons, you deal with the worldview, or you deal with the foundation of the world is rather than the evidence or the data that is being exchanged back and forth. And so a lot of should I say this? A lot of people that aren't too fond of the presuppositional approach, because ultimately that's what it is. When you're going about this method, you're dealing with the presuppositions of your opponent. You're saying my opponent has certain presuppositions or beliefs about the worldview. I am going to attack those presuppositions rather than dealing with the evidence that is being exchanged back and forth. And so using the presuppositional approach, you're evaluating the worldview. And a lot of people that aren't too fond of the presuppositional approach would say, you know what? That's effective against an atheist, a naturalist, a skeptic. It works. But what about religious worldviews? That's where it falls apart because they have a God too. They have a revelation. Because ultimately, what are we saying? That the Bible is our foundation, and that the Bible provides whatever is necessary to correspond to reality. And those are the preconditions of intelligibility. We discussed the preconditions of intelligibility last week. But in short, there are certain things that must be met in order for intelligibility to exist, in order for us to function as intelligent creatures. such as reasoning. How do we know that we can trust our reasoning? How do we know that we can trust our induction? How do we know the future is like the future is like the past? How can we trust our memory, language, and the things that we read? How do we practice science? All of this, all of this, in order for it to function, these must be met in order for there to be intelligibility. And so, when we say, when we're trying to evaluate a worldview and to see whether it corresponds to reality, this is what we're essentially saying. Whether a worldview provides the preconditions to intelligibility. Whether a worldview can make sense of us acting and functioning as intelligent creatures. Because that's how we function in reality. We take a lot of things for granted, but we go about trusting in our reasoning, trusting in deductions, knowing that we ought to apply laws of logic, knowing that the future is going to be like the past. We assume the sun is going to rise again. We assume laws of gravity laws of physics are going to still apply. And so we assume that when we look at something, we can trust our sight, our senses, etc. We just take a lot of these for granted. So we'll say that the Christian worldview is the very precondition. It's the only worldview that can provide the preconditions and that can meet the preconditions for intelligibility, therefore making reality possible. And that if you remove the foundation of Christianity, the contrary would be impossible. And here's what I mean. That if Christianity was true, we would not be able to function as intelligent creatures. Intelligibility would not exist in reality. And so people that are not too fond of the presuppositional approach, I would say that's great. You have a God. Your God allows you to account for induction. Your God allows you to account for perception. Your God allows you to account for reasoning. Your God allows you to account for morality. Great, you have a justification. So it's effective against the individual that doesn't have God as their foundation, that doesn't have a God system, a religious system, but it is not effective when it comes to competing religious worldviews. So this week, and that is sort of like the preface, but this week we're going to go into comparative religious worldviews. Where we're basically saying, you know what, it's practically the same thing. You are using the same principles, you are using the same tools to be able to critique and evaluate their worldview. Practically just looks different because arguments are different. Let's see if there's anything else before we go on. Any questions up until now? Prerequisites. So his question is, how else do we would we explain, what do we mean when we say preconditions to intelligibility? We mean prerequisites, certain things that must be true in order for us to function as intelligent creatures, in order for us to reason. We need to know that we can rely on our reasoning. In order for us to drive, in order for us to walk, we need to know that we can trust our sight of sense and other perceptive senses. We take for granted. I think these are things that we innately know, that we instinctively know, but we take for granted. And here's the illustration that Bonson uses. We go about breathing oxygen. And he usually makes this comparison with the atheist or with the unbeliever. As we go about breathing oxygen, we take that for granted, all the while denying that oxygen exists. We innately function in a certain way in reality, and unbelievers, although they instinctively function that way, they deny the very foundation. They deny the very thing they know that exists, that makes it possible for them to exist a certain way, or to function a certain way. So dealing with comparative religious worldviews, you're basically using the same tools. You're utilizing the same things as Bonson would say. Essentially, you need to be asking the questions so that your opponent gives you the rope in which you hang him with. Again, you are asking questions in order to have your opponent give you the rope in which you hang him with. Because keep in mind that the Christian worldview is the only one that can meet the precondition, that can provide the preconditions to intelligibility, that can correspond to reality. And so by asking the right questions, you're essentially trying to figure out holes, errors in your opponent's worldview. And those inconsistencies, errors in your opponent's worldview is going to give you the upper hand or the rope in which you dismember, in which you disprove their worldview. Demolish their worldview, as Paul would say, and bring them to the obedience of knowledge of Christ. So how does it play out? It's going to play out the same exact way. All religious worldviews must be evaluated on the same basis. Is it internally coherent? Does this religious system make sense internally? Is it consistent? Is there any arbitrariness? Because when you have a religious system, they still function within a framework of beliefs. You're trying to see if those beliefs make sense with one another. Or are they just arbitrary claims that are being made without any justification? And two, whether that belief system or worldview, religious worldviews, can provide the preconditions to intelligibility. Given the religious worldview, so for example, given a religious worldview, can it account for the fact that we are able to rely on our reasoning? Given a certain religious worldview, can it account for morality? Given a certain religious worldview, can it account for uniformity? And etc. Does that make sense? If not, ask questions, because this is key. Whether a religious worldview can provide the intelligibility that is necessary, or the preconditions to intelligibility that is necessary. Does that make sense? No? Let me see if I can get the outline from last week. And instead of writing the everything on the board, when I say everything, I mean the preconditions to intelligibility. Should be okay. Because I think in order for us to understand how to evaluate worldviews and the basis in which we evaluate a worldview, we must understand what we mean when we say preconditions to intelligibility. Does a worldview provide the preconditions to intelligibility? And what are the preconditions to intelligibility? What is necessary in order for you to function with intelligibility in reality? That's one of them, yes. And so logic is a necessary prerequisite in order for us to function intelligibly, as intelligible creatures. And so intelligibility, logic must be able to be accounted for in order for intelligibility to exist. Intelligibility does exist, therefore our worldview must account for the laws of logic. That's one example. If you look at 5, 2, it says, it gives somewhat of a list of the preconditions to intelligibility. This is from last week's, and the viewers at home, you can find this document again on lesson 2.1 of our YouTube page. It's in the description. So essentially, every worldview, regardless if it's religious in its nature or not, must be able to provide the preconditions of intelligibility in order to correspond to reality. Is that understood? In reality, we know that there's intelligibility. Our worldview must correspond in such a way where it can account for the prerequisites of that intelligibility. I know I'm being very repetitive, but that is key, even when evaluating religious worldviews. And yeah. That's a good question, and that's one of the bases in which we evaluate. So one is the question. It was, I'm sorry for those at home. The question was, what about religious worldviews that say I don't need a reason for the things that I'm claiming? I simply take it by faith. Is that correct? So there's claims that are being made by certain religious worldviews that say, well, I don't need to explain it away. It's just something that I take by faith. And what I would say is that, again, when we deal with a worldview, we're evaluating it internally as well to see whether it makes sense. Is there any arbitrariness? Arbitrariness is exactly what that claim is. When an individual says, I believe something just because I believe it, I don't need to give a reason for why I believe it. He's basically saying, I don't need to justify my claims. That is arbitrary. That is one way of evaluating the worldview internally. And so if a worldview has arbitrariness, you're already spotting errors in the worldview where it just does not make sense. Huh? I pray. Yeah, I prayed about it. A feeling came about, but again, that's just as arbitrary as attempting to justify, say, rape because I prayed about it and I felt okay. I felt good with it, so I moved on. You can justify anything with arbitrariness. If arbitrariness is allowed, and to be rational, to function within an intelligent society, arbitrariness cannot be allowed. It is not allowed with rationale. And so, again, even with these worldviews, we're evaluating them off of their internal system as well. Is there any arbitrariness, consistencies, inconsistencies, as well as do they provide the preconditions to intelligibility? So, moving on to the actual worldviews. Now, I know there's a lot of religious worldviews, so the way that Bonson divides it up, which I think is awesome, by the way, for viewers at home, and I think you guys do know this for the most part, Bonson has a great, I think it's 22 disc CD set. I would recommend this for anyone that is pursuing apologetics, and I would say that every Christian must pursue apologetics. It's called Defending the Christian Worldview Against All Opposition. So there's Series 1, Series 2, 22 discs, 22 disc series. I think normally, yeah, we'll post a link. I think I posted it on our ACL page sometime last week, but it is very resourceful. In fact, a lot of my resources, my teachings come from Bonson, being one of the top presuppositional apologists, and the guy just has a brilliant mind. So what he does is he constructs a system, three-way system where he says, all religious worldviews can fall under any of these systems. And so instead of saying, okay, what about this religion? What about this branch of Hindus? All worldviews, religious worldviews, can fall within these three systems. And so if you know how to work within one system, and you know how to ask the right questions to evaluate the worldviews within this category, you can be able to deal with all religions that fall under this category. So, first one, religions of transcendent mysticism. Again, sorry that I couldn't print you the outlines. If you guys have smartphones, you can view them on your smartphone. Go to our YouTube link, lesson 2.2. You'll see the description of the Google Docs in our description. Is it? Okay. So those viewing at home, it's also on our Facebook page. So religions of transcendent mysticism, you have religions of immanent moralism, and you have religions of pseudo-Christianity. Religions of transcendent mysticism are religions that which go beyond human experience and can only be communicated in mystical ways. So one example is Hinduism. Within Hinduism, you reach enlightenment, and when I say enlightenment, it is knowledge of true reality. And so what religions of transcendent mysticism would say is that there is, for example, with Hinduism, there is true reality. There is ultimate reality, which is called Brahman. True reality, that is who God is. Within that reality, everything is one. And for us to know that reality, and here's where epistemology comes in, right? They're claiming something about reality. They're saying reality is one. Reality is Brahman. In order for us to know our claims, our beliefs, in order for us to know and correspond to that reality, We must do it in such a way where it detaches ourselves from all human experience. That's where you have practices of yoga and etc. Where you clear my mind, when you clear your mind of all human experience, that includes not only logic, but as well as perception, language, any human experience. So for you to know in your epistemology, for you to justify your claims of Brahman, of reality, of this enlightenment, you cannot use any human experience to justify it. When I say justify, I mean give a reason as to why you believe it. Now I think you guys can already see the problem in this. And the reason that they would say that we need to reach enlightenment by detaching ourselves from this world is because the way we are is in our mind, in our human experience, we have a distorted view of reality. That the way we view reality right now is an illusion. It is Maya. And so in order for us to understand true reality, ultimate reality, Brahman, what we must do is detach ourselves from our distorted view in which we make all these distinctions. What is and isn't, everything is one. We must completely detach ourselves and move beyond human experience to know true reality, to be enlightened to Brahman, to reach nirvana. So what are some problems that you see? Based on the two things, again, let me see if I can put it up. Based on the two things that we must evaluate worldviews on. So to know true reality, ultimate reality, one must not use or claim any human experience to justify what they know about it. So human experience or rationale cannot be used to justify any claims about reality, and you can already see the arbitrariness in the religions of transcendent mysticism. When I say arbitrariness, is that you're already evaluating these worldviews as being arbitrary, as being inconsistent. And can you guys see why it would be arbitrary? If you're making claims about reality, you're saying, I know what is, but it is not based on human experience. It is not based on rationale. It is not based on anything that I can experience. It is not based on my language. It is not based on perception. It just is. And the way we know is by moving away from all that. So your justification for how you know what you know is not logical, it's not based on logic, nor is it based on perception or any other human experience. It cannot be justified by human experience, therefore is arbitrary. Does that make sense? And so moving on to the revelations. Hey, you know, they have a revelation, we have a revelation. And so their revelation being the Bhagavad Gita versus our revelation being the Bible is one where, because put it this way, if you see arbitrariness, that's already an error in their that's already an error in their worldview. But now to ask whether it can provide the preconditions, because they can always resort to the Bhagavad Gita. Well, how do you know? Well, someone reached enlightenment and it was written to us. We have a revelation. Now, it's not from God, and we'll go about seeing the errors in it, but some man reached enlightenment, wrote it, and that's how we know. That is their ultimate authority, the revelation in which they can justify their claims. So, comparing the two authorities, because when it comes down to it, you're comparing ultimate authorities, and so if you're comparing, evaluating um, religions of transcendent mysticism, Hinduism being one, based on the Bhagavad Gita versus the Bible, we're trying to see whether the Bhagavad Gita can provide the preconditions versus the Christian worldview, the Christian revelation. And so the Bible, you deal with a personal God who created the world and governs it sovereignly such that you can have consistencies, such that you can practice science, such that you can know that the laws of logic, that laws of physics will apply in the future, and who has also communicates to his creatures or creation through human experience, being perception, senses, rationale, language. And so God can communicate this to his creation based on his revelation and based on how he has created us to be and his nature being personal. And so we had a little incident. Um, you can go get a napkin if you'd like. Just make sure you go around. So, evaluating the Bhagavad Gita, evaluating their ultimate authority, their revelation, you're dealing with, because you're trying to see whether their revelation can account and provide the preconditions to intelligibility. Preconditions being that, we function in reality knowing that we can trust our senses. We function knowing that laws of logic exist. Laws of logic are absolute, unchanging, universal. We can know that we can trust our reasoning, and etc. So the Bhagavad Gita being an impersonal God who cannot communicate to us through human experience. Again, the Bhagavad Gita would state that Brahman, God, reality, is an impersonal God who cannot communicate to us through human experience. So to reach this idea, to be enlightened to this idea or knowledge of reality being Brahman or God, to them reality is Brahman, reality is God, true reality, ultimate reality. And God is not the one that has communicated to us. He cannot communicate. He cannot reveal himself as such. But rather, it is dependent on what? It must, if God is not the one to reveal himself to us, we must rely on human experience to be able to know who God is, to be able to communicate the reality of God, the reality of Brahman. But the problem is we must detach ourselves from reality in order to know what reality is. Yeah. That is inconsistency. Um, what he was saying is that basically that there's more inconsistency within the worldview, given that because you're dealing with an impersonal God who cannot communicate to you, you must rely on human experience to be able to know Brahman, to be able to know God, to be able to know reality, this oneness. However, it teaches within itself its own system that you must detach from that reality. And so you have, as far as epistemology goes, you have no foundation, no justification to know that reality. Because yes, given in one sense, Your ultimate authority when it comes to your epistemology cannot be subjective. It cannot rely on human reasoning, or I'm sorry, it cannot rely on human experience, and this is where we're going to go next. It cannot rely on human experience, but rather it must transcend human experience. Because if you're trying to justify intelligibility, you're trying to justify human experience, whether it's language, reasoning, or perception. It must be something apart from you to justify that. You cannot use your reasoning to justify your reasoning. It becomes viciously circular. Same thing with perception, same thing with um, induction or memory. You are begging the very thing that's in question. So, in one sense, yes, it must transcend. But when you are justifying it, you cannot use your own human experience to be able to acquire that information. The transcendent information. It must be given. But the problem is within transcendent mysticism, although our ultimate authority must be transcendent in its nature, something that is given to us rather than acquired, within religions of transcendent mysticism, you don't have that communication. God is an impersonal God who cannot communicate himself, who does not communicate himself to you or to us. I don't know if we have time. We're not gonna have much time. So if you guys want, again, look at the outline, but it deals a little bit more with Maya, with Nirvana. Maya being the distorted perception of reality, Nirvana being the enlightenment to the knowledge of true reality. Um, it compares the two um, in regards to its errors that it commits and etc. But in short, um, there's arbitrariness within religions of transcendent mysticism in the sense where the justification for their claims of reality, I know what is in reality, is based beyond human experience and is not being justified by human experience. Um, and so it even goes to the point of, and ultimately it even goes to the point of rejecting logic. Because this whole idea that, within Maya, and this is where we get into Maya and or Nirvana, within Maya, we have this sort of view of reality. We see distinctions, A and not A. But within Nirvana, you're enlightened to the point where everything is one. You see clearly of true reality. You know that there is no distinction between everything because everything is one. And until you detach yourself from that kind of uh, uh, thinking, you cannot reach reality. So basically, you must reject reality. I'm sorry, you must reject logic and the logical or the Western way of thinking in order to be enlightened and in order for you to understand true reality, that there is no distinction. However, what does that assume? That there's a distinction between Maya and Nirvana. But if there's a distinction between Maya and Nirvana, then there is no distinction between Maya and Nirvana. Does that make sense? So if they're basically saying there ultimately is no distinction. There's no A and not A. These laws don't apply. If the laws of logic don't apply, then they do apply. Does that make sense? That's inconsistencies. If you're stating that my worldview, there is no A, true reality of what is has no distinctions. Everything is one. You cannot say something is and isn't. They're both one. There are no distinctions. Those distinctions are based on your distorted perception of reality, Maya. But Nirvana, once you're enlightened to true reality, you see everything as one, that there is no distinction. And so laws of non-contradiction would not apply for you to say something is and is not. And if laws of non-contradiction do not apply, then they do apply. Because if you are not basing your claims on logical laws, on laws of logic, where you can say, hey, you know what, we cannot believe something is and isn't at the same time. If you're not basing your reasoning on the laws of logic, laws of contradiction being one of them, then it would not apply. It would make sense. Well, not that it would make sense. It's nonsensical, but you can reject inconsistency. You can reject logic, and you would be able to apply, say, contradictory claims. Yeah. Well, it's Hinduism. They, I don't know if they wouldn't say that they're in another dimension. They would say that their understanding has been so detached from Maya, from human experience, that they can truly understand and see reality for what it is, true reality, Brahman for what it is, that everything is one, etc. But the problem is, even practically, when they live their lives making distinctions. They don't function in a way where everything is one. If the worldview of religious worldview of transcendent mysticism was true, Hinduism being one of them, we would be functioning in a way where we cannot make claims of non-contradictory claims to say something is and isn't. Because if reality is all one, laws of logic would not apply because of the laws of logic that we can make distinctions. And so we can make contradictory claims. We can state that something is and isn't. So that's why I say if you reject logic, you can accept inconsistencies in your system. But if you can accept inconsistencies in your system, then you cannot accept inconsistencies in your system. So no, it does not provide the preconditions to intelligibility. It does not justify why we function the way we do in reality, knowing that we can trust our reasoning, knowing that we can function in such a way where we can trust our senses. Um, there's arbitrariness, and so a lot of these things must be evaluated and critiqued on its own, within its own system, internally. Moving on to religions of immanent moralism. How come you guys aren't there? Oh, you guys are in the living room. By the way, they're going to be people are going to be coming there. You guys won't be able to use it at the practice. Second one is religions of immanent moralism. Religions of immanent moralism is opposite of religions of transcendent mysticism. Transcendent mysticism would say something that is apart from human experience. Religions of immanent moralism would say the opposite, where it involves or is part of human experience. Confucianism being one of them, Buddhism being another one. So this is where Buddhism would come in. And so what they would say is that these are basically essentially systems that derive their teachings from religious leaders. And so when you're saying, well, what we ought to do and we ought not to do is derived from one man's teaching. So now when you're dealing with, hey, you have a religious leader, I have a religious leader, we're practically saying the same thing. Your religious leader is just making different claims. My religious leader is just making different claims. However, it's not as simple as that. Because when we're dealing with, say, the teachings of Jesus versus the teachings of Confucius, we're dealing with two different systems, two completely different systems where one of them makes sense internally and can provide the preconditions. If you're dealing with Confucianism, Buddhism, what it is essentially saying is that morality and all its teachings from Confucius or Buddha is derived from one man. They may even say, I mean, they would say is wise and everything, but nonetheless is still derived from what? From the conventions of one man's mind. So if you're to look at it with the two systems, the two worldviews, Christianity would state that, God sent his son to reveal his law to us, being the law of Christ. He's also done it in history through Israel. He's also written the law of the works of the law in our hearts, that we can have an innate moral compass. And so it makes sense to say, you know what? God sent his son to provide us a way to live. It becomes objective. Now, at this point, the question is not whether it's true. To critique it internally, we're saying our system can make sense of objective morality. Where God sent his son, he set laws, he instituted laws of Christ, and this is how you ought to live. He's given the works of the law in our hearts. We know what to do, what not to do. It becomes objective. We can justify it based on objectivity. Versus one man that comes in and then builds or institutes teachings, laws, morality based on the conventions of his mind. It becomes subjective. So why should you, by what authority is he coming up with these standards? Why should you submit to the teachings of this one man? Why is something right and wrong because of what he said? If it is simply on the basis, on the sole basis of his opinion or preference of his mind, yeah. Confucius or Buddha? Buddha, Confucius? Buddha? Um, yeah, that may be true. But again, you're now left with, even then when evaluating the system, because what Joe was saying is that Buddha was saying, they're not necessarily exclusive claims. Whatever works for you, go ahead, follow those. But again, it's no different than if he was to make exclusive claims, because it just simply becomes an opinion. So what if it's his opinion? Well, my opinion differs. Now, all Buddha was saying is like, that's fine. If your opinion differs, it differs. Go with it. But you're no longer left with any justification or any way, given the worldview, to account for objective morality. In the same way, not only can it not provide an account for morality, it cannot provide any of the preconditions for the rest of it, for intelligibility, being reasoning, being human experience, perception, etc. If everything is to be based on human experience, because immanent basically means part of, to be involved, involve to involve your human experience to justify morality, to justify um, reasoning, to justify um, perception, your memory, a lot of it becomes subjective. And when you're dealing with your ultimate authority, given the worldview, you cannot truly account for how you know what you know. For example, being reasoning. How do you know that you can trust your reasoning? If your justification is based and utilizes your reasoning, it becomes viciously circular. And that's the case in any kind of when justifying your ultimate authority when it comes to epistemology. That becomes the case when at any point when you try to subjectively justify um, reasons as to why you can function as intelligent creatures. Same thing with perception. Same thing with uniformity. Same thing with um, so many the other the other preconditions. Um, let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to move quickly. I must have some time, but so, and I think it's also crucial when we study epistemology. It's also crucial to understand why human experience cannot be used to account for the preconditions to intelligibility when it comes to your ultimate authority. Does that make sense as to why? It's basically the reason why we have the transcendent argument. And so when we say, how do you know that you can trust your reasoning? How would you justify it? Using your reasoning, using any kind of human experience. It'd be circular. You would be begging the question. And so at any point, if your ultimate authority is something that is part of human experience, it cannot justify it because it utilizes subjective, it utilizes something that is subjective. Same thing with our senses. Same thing with our memory. Same thing with the uniformity. How do you know that the future will be like the past? Because it always has been. Anytime you utilize, does that make sense? Well, that's why we say the Christian worldview is the one that can provide it. Because when you ask the Christian, how do you know they can rely on your reasoning? What are they appealing to? Something apart from them, something that is transcendent from them. A personal God who is transcendent and that could give you innately those abilities by virtue of being made in His image. So when we say, how do you know that you can rely on your reasoning, or how do you account for the laws of logic, we're not appealing to ourselves. We're not appealing to something that is subjective and part of human experience. We're appealing to something that is transcendent, a transcendent being who is also personal, and that can communicate directly to his creation in such a way where it becomes innate in us. When we deal with the communicable attributes of God, God is rational. Laws of logic exist in the mind of God. And being the gracious God He is, the personal God He is, He has communicated to individuals made in His image, so that we too can be rational. We too can have a portion of rationality. And so when we talk about laws of logic, it exists in the mind of God and has been communicated to us as well, where we can function in a similar way. So our justification for it becomes what? Transcendent. And it's not something where we acquire, where we are reasoning to God. We're saying God is, He gave. But so in any kind of way where this worldview or religions of this world we try to provide preconditions, all the justification for it would essentially be based on human experience. And so all you do is you're left with subjectivity. You're left with a lot of arbitrary claims when it comes to morality. Um, and it simply does not explain how the world or how reality is. Because it does not provide the preconditions to intelligibility. It does not correspond to reality. The third category, we deal with religions of pseudo-Christianity. These are religions that are polytheistic, that are Unitarian, and that are pseudo-messianic in its nature. When I say polytheistic, multiple gods, Unitarian, one person, one God, which both are distortions of the biblical God or the God depicted in the Bible. And the third one being pseudo-messianic, where you have cults of different, professing to have different messiahs. And again, all of those, the way you deal with religions of pseudo-Christianity, all of them, whether it's Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, or Christian cults, the way you deal with it is basically it deals with the revelation. So what it states is that because all religions of pseudo-Christianity would grant previous revelation that is depicted in the Bible. It grants the authority of Scripture, but it just states that this is additional revelation to that. In the same way where we have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament. The same way we have the Bible, Islam would claim, God revealed it also in the Quran. It is further or additional revelation. So all additional, the way you do it is all additional or further revelation must be taken in light of previous revelation. So all further revelation, being the Book of Mormon, Quran, must be taken in light of previous revelation. Now, they would have no problem with that, except what do they claim about previous revelation in any of the pseudo-Christian worldviews, except for pseudo-messianic. It's been tampered with. It's been changed. But now, what do you do? How do you deal with those questions? What are you evaluating? Because those are claims within their worldview. How do you justify the claim that it's been tampered? Again, you're evaluating their worldview. Their worldview has a belief. Yeah, yes, it is further revelation. The Book of Mormon, the Quran, all of those are further revelation based, and it grants the authority of previous revelation. However, the worldview states that previous revelation has been tampered. Therefore, we need further or additional revelation to interpret previous revelation that has been tampered with. But that is a claim that it's making. Internally, that's how the system is working. But when you ask the right questions, well, where has it been? When has it been tampered? Where's the evidence? Where's the justification for the claim you're making? I assure you, you're not going to get any. Um, it's arbitrary claims, and this is why I say these two. I mean, they're a lot more, I suppose, easier. You're not going to be dealing with too many of these guys, but it's primarily Muslims, primarily Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. So the misconception is that, hey, you know what? When it comes to presuppositional apologetics, all you're doing is you're going back to evidence. Um, you're not dealing with the presuppositions. You're not dealing with the presuppositional approach when it comes to religious worldviews being Islam, Muslim, etc. I'm sorry, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormon. But you're taking the same principles. Because again, with presuppositional apologetics, the principle, the focus is that you are evaluating their worldview to see if it is internally coherent, is it arbitrary, is it inconsistent, and does it provide the preconditions to intelligibility. You are doing exactly the same thing with the religious worldview. So the Muslim who claims that the Bible has been tampered with and is making a claim in order for the worldview to be consistent, where the Quran must be used to interpret the Bible, or the Book of Mormon is used to interpret the Bible, is based on their claim that previous revelation has been tampered. But wait, where is your justification for it? There's already arbitrariness. And so when dealing with it, you're going to go back and forth on the evidence of the manuscripts. These are the things you're going to be dealing with. So the principle is still the same when it comes to presuppositional. However, the content in which you go about it looks differently practically, because now you're dealing with manuscripts. You're dealing with future prior revelation, but you're still dealing with the worldview at its core. So you have arbitrariness. See if there's anything else. We're almost done, so I do want to just hurry it up. And each one, I assure you, each one is going to look differently. You're using the same principles, but it's going to look differently. And so, when also critiquing it internally, the way you go about it is you're essentially you're claiming that additional revelation fails on its own basis because it conflicts with previous revelation. So you're saying additional revelation says that previous revelation has been tampered with, but we have no justification for that claim. You cannot account for that claim. You cannot make that claim and have it be justified and be true, just because there is no evidence of it. So to show that future revelation does fall apart, you go to previous revelation. This is where you try to show the conflict between the two. This is where it looks more evidential in its nature, because it is. You're dealing with different revelations. You're trying to show that future revelation is incorrect in light of previous revelation. And so you deal with verses. You deal with the content. That's pretty much it. Again, in regards to this this category, there's a lot that needs to be studied in regards to the verses, in regards to the claims that, say, Islam would make in contrast to the claims that Scripture would make, the Book of Mormon in contrast to the claims that the Bible would make. And so there is a need to study each one of the religions, and I would urge you guys to do so. But basically, as a broad outline, broad practice, etc., this is what it is, and you guys can find a lot more information on the outlines, which again you can find on our ACL Facebook page or YouTube channel. You go to the lesson 2.2 in the description. With that said, again, some resources I would really urge you guys to invest into this. Again, you can find that American Vision. It was on sale last week. I don't know if it still is, but this is a must for anyone that has a heart and passion for apologetics. There are other great books that Bonson does have. There are more and less scholarly books that you can also get. I think one book that's great to start off with is Ultimate Proof by Jason Lyle, Dr. Jason Lyle. Um, he also has a video, but I would recommend getting the book. Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, he doesn't have a degree in philosophy, but he's a brilliant mind. He's a great mind. It's a lot easier to read. Yes, Boston's Boston stuff when it comes to when it comes to the level of difficulty in reading, it is a lot greater than say Lyle's stuff. But again, he makes it he conveys it easier. He makes it easier to understand, which is what's great. But yet he still has the brilliance in how he articulates what he does and the things that he says. It makes sense. So those are great books. Van Til again, writing is very difficult, scholarly, but go ahead and read it. Any other resources? Oliphant. Scott Oliphant is also great as well. A bit different, and falls under a different camp of presuppositionalism. There's Van Tillian, and but he's also great to read. I don't know if there's any specific books, but that's pretty much it. So we're gonna close, and Brian, you can stop the broadcast, and we'll go ahead and pray.